Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story. I never thought I'd be writing one of these posts, but after what happened this past month, I needed to share this insanity with people who would understand. This is the story of how my neighbor tried to claim ownership of my driveway through her HOA position, and how I shut that nonsense down for good. Background. My wife and I bought our house about 2 years ago in what seemed like a nice, quiet neighborhood. Our property sits at the entrance to a cul-de-sac with a unique layout. We have a circular driveway that wraps around a small garden island. It's one of the reasons we fell in love with the place. The driveway is wider than most in the neighborhood and can easily fit 4 cars. When we first moved in, we were told there was a homeowners association, but it was pretty relaxed. Annual dues were reasonable, mostly covering community landscaping, snow removal for common areas, and maintenance of the small playground and park at the end of the street. I'm not generally a fan of HOA, but this one seemed harmless enough. Our house is positioned in a way that our driveway is somewhat separate from the main part of the neighborhood. There's a small strip of trees between our property and the rest of the houses, so we feel like we have our own little secluded space despite being in a subdivision. About 6 months ago, a new family moved in 3 houses down, a couple with 2 teenage kids. The wife, who I'll call Karen, not her real name obviously, immediately got involved with the HOA and was elected to the board within 2 months. I didn't pay much attention to HOA politics, so I didn't think much of it at the time. How it started. The trouble began when Karen started hosting weekly book club meetings at her house. Every Tuesday afternoon, about 6 and 8 cars would show up, making parking on our narrow street a bit tight. Not a big deal. Happens occasionally. One Tuesday about 3 months ago, I came home from work early to find 2 unfamiliar cars parked in my driveway. I figured they must belong to visitors who got confused about which house they were visiting, so I waited a few minutes to see if anyone would come move them. When no one did, I walked down the street and saw a gathering at Karen's house. I knocked on her door, and when she answered, I politely said, "Hi, I think some of your guests might have parked in my driveway by mistake. Would you mind asking them to move their cars?" Karen gave me this look of mild annoyance. "Oh, I told them they could park there. Your driveway is so big, and you're not using all of it anyway. It's just for a couple of hours." I was taken aback, but tried to remain polite. "I understand parking can be tight, but that's my private property. I'd appreciate it if your guests would move their cars." She sighed dramatically. "Fine, I'll tell them, but it seems selfish when you have all that space going unused." I walked away thinking it was just a misunderstanding. The cars were moved within a few minutes, and I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. Escalation. The following Tuesday, I came home to find 3 cars in my driveway. This time, I was less patient. I went straight to Karen's house. "Excuse me," I said when she opened the door, "but there are several cars in my driveway again. I thought I made it clear last week that I don't want people parking there." Karen crossed her arms. "Actually, as an HOA board member, I've been reviewing the community guidelines. Your driveway is technically considered overflow parking for community events." "What? That's ridiculous," I said. "It's my private property, not community property." She smiled smugly. "You might want to check your HOA agreement. Section 5.3 discusses community parking provisions." I was furious, but decided to check before escalating further. I asked her guests to move their cars, which they did, looking embarrassed about the whole situation. That night, I dug out our HOA documents and read them carefully. There was indeed a section 5.3 about parking, but it only specified that street parking was available to all residents and their guests, with the caveat that driveways and private property were excluded from this provision. In other words, Karen was completely making up the overflow parking claim. The next day, I emailed the HOA president, explaining the situation and attaching the relevant section of the agreement. He responded quickly, apologizing for the confusion and assuring me he would speak to Karen. I thought that would resolve things. Again, I was wrong. The confrontation. The following Tuesday, I made sure to come home early. Sure enough, at around 3:30 p.m., cars started arriving for Karen's book club. I watched from my window as she actually directed 2 cars into my driveway. I immediately went outside to confront her. "Karen, what are you doing? I've already clarified with the HOA president that my driveway is not community parking." She had the audacity to look annoyed. "Oh, please, it's just for a few hours. Tom, the HOA president, agreed it makes sense to use available space for community functions." "That's not what he told me," I replied. "Please have your guests move their cars immediately." "No," she said firmly. "As an HOA board member, I'm making an executive decision. Your driveway is underutilized and the community needs the parking space." I was dumbfounded. "That's not how this works. This is private property, not HOA property." "Well, she said with a smirk. "We can discuss this at the next board meeting. Until then, the cars stay. If you have a problem with it, you'll have to take it up with the board formally." At this point, I decided to take a different approach. "Fine. The cars can stay for now, but I want to be clear that this is the last time." She looked triumphant as she walked away. What she didn't know was that I was already on the phone with a towing company. The revenge begins. 20 minutes later, a tow truck pulled up. Karen and several of her book club members rushed out when they realized what was happening. "What do you think you're doing?" Karen screeched. "Having unauthorized vehicles towed from my private property," I replied calmly, "as is my legal right. You can't do that. This is HOA-approved parking." The tow truck driver looked at me questioningly. "I have the property deed right here," I said, showing him the documentation I had ready. "And I have email confirmation from the HOA president that this is indeed private property, not subject to community parking rules." Karen was turning red with anger. "Stop this right now! I'm calling Tom." "Go ahead," I said. "I already spoke with him yesterday." While Karen frantically called the HOA president, the tow truck driver began hooking up the first car. The book club members were in a panic, trying to figure out whose car was being towed. A woman rushed forward. "That's my car. Please stop." I actually felt bad for her, as she seemed genuinely distressed and probably had just followed Karen's directions. "If you move it right now, I won't have it towed," I told her. She quickly got in her car and backed out of my driveway. The second car owner came running as well, and I made the same offer. Karen was still on the phone, gesturing wildly and pacing back and forth. When she finally got off the phone, she marched up to me. "Tom says there's been a misunderstanding. He never authorized use of your driveway." "I know," I replied. "That's what I've been telling you." "This is ridiculous," she shouted, now drawing attention from other neighbors. "You're being completely unreasonable. The HOA has jurisdiction over the entire neighborhood." "No, it doesn't," I said firmly. "The HOA has jurisdiction over common areas and certain aspects of home appearance. It has zero authority over my private property, including my driveway." "We'll see about that," she threatened before storming off to her house, her book club in disarray. The HOA meeting. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following week, and I made sure to attend. Karen had apparently been spreading her version of events throughout the neighborhood, painting me as the villain who was refusing to share during community events. When the issue came up on the agenda, Karen immediately launched into her narrative. "As many of you know, we have a resident who is refusing to allow community parking in his oversized driveway during neighborhood events," she began. "This kind of selfish behavior is exactly what the HOA was designed to prevent. I propose we amend the bylaws to explicitly include private driveways as potential overflow parking during sanctioned community events." Several of her friends nodded in agreement. I waited for my turn to speak. The HOA president, Tom, looked uncomfortable. "Before we discuss any amendments, I think we need to clarify the current rules. Our existing agreement specifically excludes private property from community parking provisions." "But we can change that," Karen insisted. "With a majority vote, we can amend the bylaws." When I was finally given the floor, I was prepared. "I've consulted with an attorney who specializes in property law and HOA regulations," I said, which was true. I'd had a consultation earlier that week. Any amendment that attempts to claim jurisdiction over private property without the owner's consent would be illegal and unenforceable. Furthermore, directing people to park on private property without permission constitutes encouraging trespassing, which could create liability issues for the HOA itself. I paused to let that sink in. "I'm not opposed to helping neighbors during special occasions, but that should be handled through polite requests, not entitlement or false claims of authority. What happened last week, with an HOA board member deliberately directing people to park on my property after being explicitly told not to, was inappropriate and potentially illegal." The room was quiet. Then, one of the older residents spoke up. "He's right. We can't just take over people's private property. That's not what the HOA is for." Several others murmured in agreement. Karen was fuming. "This is about community spirit, about helping each other out. Some people just want all the benefits of living in a nice neighborhood without any of the sacrifices." "I pay my HOA dues like everyone else," I responded. "I follow the rules about lawn maintenance, exterior paint colors, and everything else in the agreement. But my driveway is my property, not community property." Tom, clearly wanting to end the uncomfortable discussion, stepped in. "I think we need to be clear about this. The HOA cannot and will not claim authority over private driveways. If you want to park in someone's driveway, you need to ask permission, and they have every right to say no." Karen looked like she wanted to argue more, but the majority of residents were nodding in agreement with Tom. "Now," Tom continued, "I think we should move on to the next agenda item. I thought that would be the end of it." But Karen wasn't done yet. The escalation. The following day, I received a letter in my mailbox. It was an official-looking HOA violation notice claiming I was in breach of Section 8.2, maintaining neighborhood harmony and community standards. The letter, signed by Karen as HOA Board Secretary, stated I had 30 days to rectify my behavior or face fines of $100 per day. I immediately called Tom. "Did you approve this violation notice?" I asked after explaining what I'd received. There was a pause. "No, I didn't. The board hasn't issued any violations related to your situation. Can you scan and email me the letter?" I did, and within an hour, Tom called back. "This is not an official HOA notice," he said, sounding angry. "Karen used the letterhead without authorization. I'll deal with this immediately." Later that day, all residents received an email from Tom clarifying that no violation had been issued and reiterating that private driveways were not subject to HOA parking regulations. I thought this public correction would finally put the matter to rest. It did not. The next Tuesday, I came home to find Karen's car parked in my driveway. Just her car, right in the middle, blocking access to my garage. I called the towing company again, but before they arrived, I decided to give Karen one last chance. I walked to her house and knocked on the door. When she answered, I said simply, "Your car is in my driveway. Move it now, or it will be towed." She smiled sweetly. "I'm hosting my book club. I'll move it in a couple of hours." "No," I said firmly. "Move it now, or it gets towed. This is your only warning." "You wouldn't dare," she said. "Not after the HOA violation." "That was a fake violation that you fabricated," I replied. "Tom already confirmed that. Move your car now." She slammed the door in my face. I walked back to my house, sat on my porch, and waited for the tow truck. When it arrived, Karen came running out of her house screaming, "You can't do this. I'm on the HOA board." The tow truck driver, the same one from before, looked at me. I nodded, and he began hooking up her car. "This is harassment," Karen shouted, drawing her book club members and several neighbors outside. "I'm calling the police." "Go ahead," I said calmly. "Explain to them how you parked on my private property without permission after being explicitly told not to." She did call the police. When the officer arrived, Karen immediately launched into a rant about how I was violating HOA regulations and harassing her. The officer listened patiently, then turned to me. "Sir, your side of the story?" I explained the situation briefly and showed him my property deed, the email from the HOA president clarifying that my driveway was private property, and even a screenshot of my doorbell camera showing me warning Karen that her car would be towed if she didn't move it. The officer turned back to Karen. "Ma'am, this appears to be private property. The owner has the right to have unauthorized vehicles removed." "But the HOA," she began. "The HOA doesn't supersede private property laws," the officer interrupted. "If you park on someone's private property without permission, they have the legal right to have your vehicle towed." By this time, the tow truck had already loaded Karen's car. She was livid, but couldn't do anything to stop it. The officer advised her that she could retrieve her car from the towing company's lot, for a fee, of course. The resolution. The following day, a certified letter arrived for Karen from the HOA board. I later learned from Tom that the board had held an emergency meeting and voted to remove Karen from her position due to her abuse of authority and creating potential legal liability for the HOA. Karen was furious, of course. She went door to door trying to rally support, but most neighbors had either witnessed her behavior firsthand or heard about it through the neighborhood grapevine. Few were sympathetic. 2 days later, I came home to find an envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a check for the towing fee and a terse note. "I still think you're being unreasonable, but my husband insists I reimburse you for the towing cost." I hadn't actually paid the towing fee. That was Karen's responsibility as the vehicle owner, but I didn't bother correcting her. I simply deposited the check and considered it compensation for the hassle. The following Tuesday, there were no cars in my driveway. Karen had apparently moved her book club to a local library meeting room. Peace was restored to the neighborhood. About a month later, a for sale sign appeared in front of Karen's house. I heard through neighbors that her husband had accepted a job in another state. Whether that was true or just a convenient excuse to leave after the embarrassment, I'll never know. That's out to the aftermath. It's been 3 months since Karen moved out. The new family that bought her house is lovely. They introduced themselves to everyone on the street and even asked if they could park in my driveway when they had their housewarming party. I said yes, of course, because they had the courtesy to ask permission. The HOA has since updated its guidelines to explicitly state that private driveways are never to be considered community parking unless the owner has given specific permission. Tom stepped down as president, feeling that he should have handled the situation more decisively from the beginning, but he remains on the board. As for me, I've gained a reputation as someone who knows the rules and stands up for himself, which I'm perfectly fine with. Several neighbors have actually come to me for advice on HOA matters since then. The funny thing is, I'm generally a helpful person. Had Karen simply asked politely if her book club could use my driveway occasionally, I probably would have said yes. It was her entitlement and attempt to use her HOA position to bully me that led to this whole fiasco. The lesson: know your rights, document everything, and don't let entitled HOA board members bully you into giving up your private property rights. And maybe, just maybe, a little courtesy goes a long way. Update: 6 months later. Wow, I didn't expect this post to get so much attention. Thanks to everyone for the supportive comments and advice. Many of you have asked for an update, so here it is. It's been about 9 months since the whole driveway debacle, and things have definitely taken some interesting turns. Grab your popcorn because there's more to this story. Remember when I mentioned Karen moved away? Well, I found out the real story behind that, and it's more satisfying than I initially thought. It turns out her husband wasn't just transferred to another state. After the HOA board removed Karen from her position, they conducted a review of all her actions during her brief tenure. What they discovered was pretty shocking. Karen had apparently been issuing fake violation notices to several other neighbors who had crossed her in some way. One elderly couple had received notices about their non-conforming garden gnomes that were supposedly too colorful. Another family had been warned about their basketball hoop, which was completely within HOA guidelines. In total, the board found evidence of 11 fraudulent violation notices, all signed by Karen with forged board approval. The board sent a formal apology to everyone affected and held a special meeting to discuss the severity of what had happened. They even consulted with an attorney about potential legal ramifications. That's when Karen's husband found out the full extent of her actions. According to my neighbor, who's friends with Karen's former next-door neighbor, there was a massive argument that could be heard through the walls. Apparently, Karen's husband works as a compliance officer for a financial institution, and he was horrified that his wife was falsifying official-looking documents. He was concerned it could potentially impact his career if it became widely known. That's what actually prompted their hasty move, not a job transfer, but damage control. But the story doesn't end there. About 2 months after Karen left, I received a certified letter. My initial reaction was dread. I thought maybe she was trying to sue me from afar or something equally dramatic. Instead, it was a formal letter of apology. I was shocked, to say the least. In the letter, Karen admitted she had been wrong to assume authority over my property and acknowledged her behavior had been inappropriate. She explained, though didn't really excuse, that she had been dealing with personal issues and had let the small amount of power from her HOA position go to her head. The letter seemed genuine, though I suspect her husband may have insisted she write it as part of making amends. The most surprising part? She included a gift card to a local restaurant for $150 as a peace offering. I debated whether to accept it, but ultimately decided to use it to take my wife out for a nice dinner. We toasted to standing our ground and the unexpected benefits of holding firm on principles. As for the HOA itself, the changes have been substantial and positive. After Tom stepped down as president, a retired attorney in our neighborhood named Diane took over. She's been amazing, professional, fair, and extremely knowledgeable about what HOA can and cannot legally do. Under Diane's leadership, the board established a new system of checks and balances. Now, any violation notice must be reviewed and approved by at least 2 board members with proper documentation of the actual violation. They've also created a more transparent appeals process and hold quarterly open forums where residents can raise concerns without fear of retaliation. The most significant change, however, is that the HOA created a comprehensive handbook that clearly outlines all rules, regulations, and the extent of HOA authority. Every homeowner received a copy, and new residents get one as part of their welcome package. The section on private property rights is particularly detailed. I suspect that's Diane's legal background at work. Many neighbors have told me they feel the HOA is now actually serving its intended purpose of maintaining community standards without overstepping boundaries. Annual dues even decreased slightly because Diane found ways to streamline some landscaping contracts. Remember the book club that started all this drama? It's still going, but it's now hosted at our community center, which was rarely used before. The HOA approved a small budget for refreshments, making it a true community event rather than Karen's private power play. Ironically, this is what community spirit actually looks like, not forcing your way onto someone's private property, but creating welcoming spaces for everyone to enjoy. My wife and I have become much more involved in neighborhood activities. We even volunteered to help organize the annual summer block party. When we needed additional parking for that event, several neighbors offered their driveways willingly. I made sure to return the favor when appropriate. The family that moved into Karen's old house has become good friends with us. They have 2 kids about the same age as our nieces, so they often play together when my sister visits. We even installed a basketball hoop in our driveway, properly approved by the HOA, of course, which has become a popular gathering spot for neighborhood kids. Recently, my wife and I were discussing potentially moving as my job might relocate me. We both realized how much we would miss this neighborhood now. What started as a frustrating conflict ended up creating a stronger, more cohesive community. Sometimes it takes standing up to a bully to bring people together. Last month, I ran into the police officer who responded that day when Karen's car was being towed. He remembered the incident and asked how things had turned out. When I told him about all the positive changes in our HOA, he laughed and said, "Sometimes the biggest troublemakers end up creating the most positive change without meaning to. I think there's wisdom in that." Karen's entitlement and abuse of power ultimately led to a better HOA, stronger community bonds, and a neighborhood where people respect each other's boundaries while still finding ways to support one another. To those dealing with similar HOA issues, stand your ground, know your rights, and document everything, but also be open to positive changes that can emerge from conflict when handled correctly. Our neighborhood is proof that sometimes confronting a problem head-on leads to the best possible outcome for everyone involved. Well, except maybe for Karen, but that's a consequence of her own making. Oh, and one last thing, I invested in some security cameras for my driveway, not because I expect any more trouble, but because the whole experience taught me the value of having clear evidence. Plus, they've already come in handy for catching the neighbor's cat who keeps leaving paw prints on my car. But that's a story for another post. Thanks again for all your support, Reddit. Sometimes standing up for yourself really does pay off in the end. Edit. For those asking about the fake violation notices, yes, those technically constituted forgery and could have led to legal consequences. The HOA board and affected neighbors decided not to pursue charges since Karen had moved away and made some attempts to apologize. Diane, our new HOA president, said it wasn't worth the legal fees when the situation had already resolved itself. I personally think Karen got off easy, but I'm just glad to have peace in the neighborhood again. The next one is a pro-revenge story. My landlord was a terrible human being. Honestly, calling him a human is even pushing it. Just a few things he has done to me over the past 3 years. Stole my dryer and other household products that are in a common area. Made me pay for a plumbing repair which was deemed normal wear and tear. Tried breaking into my house. Retaliated against me because I went to my lawyer after he sent me a letter about a parking spot. He tried charging me an extra $150 a month. Mind you, I was never late for rent in 3 years, except for when he made me pay for the plumbing repair. So the next month I was a couple days late. The list goes on. Now this apartment was nowhere near nice. I found out the plumbing was illegal. He left me with a porch for years that has severe safety issues. The ceiling paint was always falling down, gas heater was not up to code, and so on. I finally got my chance to leave after he wanted to raise my rent $500 a month. He will do anything and everything to get more money out of his tenants. So I called the building inspector 4 days before I left. I told him everything. The porch, when he finally replaced it, didn't have a permit and was definitely not up to code. I told him about the plumbing and the heater. I went on and on. The inspector came over the very next day. I saw him taking measurements. Each violation is a $500 a day fine until fixed. I honestly don't know what happened, but my God, did it feel good to finally get him back. He's at the very least on the town's radar. A week before I moved out, he tried telling me I needed to be out at a specific time. I never responded, and where I lived, that's not how it works. He tried to threaten me with the police if I wasn't gone. Well, I went to the police myself that morning to warn them. The landlord did come by, threaten me, and harass me. I called the police. They informed him I was in the right. Long story short, he had broken into my apartment. I had left to go to storage while I was gone. He nailed my door shut. I told the police to get the supervisor because I was over being harassed by this guy. Go figure he left before the supervisor could get there. I'm positive he knew he'd be arrested on sight. Got the police report, they're charging him with a felony for breaking and entering. Fines plus a charge. Don't be a jerk to good people. The next one is a malicious compliances story. I finally have a story for this sub. So, background, I work in U.S. Customs compliance, which, due to the current administration, is annoyingly unstable. Tariffs are being changed left and right, as well as the definitions of what products count as what kind of products or materials being classified as specific exceptions. It's a mess. However, there's this thing called duty drawback that ended up being a big deal at my company. To really water it down, if Company A imports products to the US but then immediately ships it to, say, Canada to their franchise stores, Company B, then technically Company A was simply a stop en route and not the ultimate receiver. Company B pays taxes, called duty, on the product, but because Company A also paid taxes, Company A is due a refund for the duty paid, hence duty drawback. So after months of chasing down this information, going back 5 years, learning we had holes in the info, trying to patch that up, trying to figure out the math, making it accurate, finding errors, etc., up to 16-hour days because someone promised we could get this done in 2 months when we needed 5, and weekends torpedoed by work calls, we finally submitted the application. And it worked. We got a great return. But because we missed the deadline by a day and it was a rocky process, my boss was let go over poor performance and missed opportunities. Never mind the fact that this project was his idea and he was the one who got it rolling in the first place. And then the higher-ups decided that they wanted records of everything covered. Not digital, though. That's not official enough. Printed in binders with official letterhead, sealed and signed, if you would. Well, my boss's superior, who is covering his desk, came to us livid at the extra work we had to do and said they want paperwork, they get paperwork. Find the biggest binders you can find and put everything on hold until they get what they want. And just to make sure they see everything, print it single-sided. So far, we have about 3,600 printed pages. Hole punched by yours truly, stuffed into 6 binders. And that got us through June of year 1. Of 5. The binder pile is 3 feet tall already, and I get to do more of that when I get back to work. Compared to what I've been through recently, this is practically a vacation, and I can't wait to see that jerk's face when we drop all of these on their desk. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.